Okay, I am now recording. All right, let me just reset this. Okay. So several issues face the pharmaceutical industry in this day and age. Given news from Katie Dwyer in a 2018 article, 6 Critical Risk Factors Facing the Pharmaceutical Industry for the Risks and Insurance Report, we first look at the opioid abuse epidemic, where major U.S. pharmaceutical companies have become the drug dealers for everyday citizens. Then the struggle presented by the lack of true competitors in the pharmaceutical industry, seeing most generic brands being pushed out, driving up the cost of essential medicines like insulin and EpiPen, and the previous leading to a rise in counterfeit drugs on the streets with substances of varying degrees of effectiveness and danger. And lastly, there's the issue of liability for companies, and with an ever-growing push for newer, better drugs, less and less testing is being done and more danger is being presented. We are gathered here today as concerned citizens to discuss and hopefully come to a consensus on how the USA could better regulate the pharmaceutical industry. I now present to you our first speaker, Nigel, who will be addressing the opioid crisis and some of the solutions to that area.
Opioids have ravaged communities all across America, thousands of communities. Before I go into the problems that opioids have caused, I want to introduce the learned intermediary doctrine. The learned intermediary doctrine makes it so the companies aren't liable. Instead of suing the companies for being a victim of opioids, you have to sue the physician who prescribed you those opioids, and the companies go scot-free. I want to mention the lack of liability, prescription error, and the predatory practices that these companies cause or practice. Lacey Leduc, who is a Cleveland attorney attacking the pharmaceutical companies, mentioned that Purdue Pharma and Cephalon have reached settlements for lying about the addiction statistics instead of actually taking actual punishments for the causes that they've resulted in the communities. Next, Max Roberts, who is a PhD student at Utah State, mentions the prescription error, which is Subsys, which is a opioid only used for cancer patients suffering from pain, is only prescribed by 4% of oncologists, and only 20% of the Subsys used in America is by cancer patients. The other 80% is all of the other uses of the painkiller. G. Caleb, who is a professor at Bloomberg, who studies in the Department of Epidemiology, mentioned the FDA's failures in the trials when they approved of certain opioids. During the FDA trials, they approved of getting rid of people who could not tolerate the opioid, and only the people who could tolerate the opioid during the trials were allowed to be tested. And this ruined the statistic of the addiction and allowed companies to produce opioids and distribute them to hospitals all around the country. My solution to the opioid epidemic is to repeal the learned intermediary doctrine. And next, Brett with product liability claim.
So drug product liability is a huge issue facing the people today, and it has affected way more people than you'd actually think. With and associations, which is a food, drug, and health law, there are actually 3 types of drug product liability claims. One being that the drugs are defectively manufactured or produced completely wrong. And the second one being pharmaceutical drugs have a dangerous side effects. This can be as large as their opioid crisis and addiction to having drowsiness and allergy medicine. And the third is being the drug is falsely marketed. So seeing that there are 3 ways a product is able to have a claim, you wouldn't think that the claims would be high, but surprisingly, and according to law.com, there are 56,041 claims done in 2019. But all these claims come from a single drug that they've used or multiple drugs that they've used. And it all comes down to the drug. And I think a good solution would be for a small pharmaceutical tax to be on a pharmacy, and from that tax money use in compensation for severe cases to help not just individuals, but families in larger severe situations like death, addiction, or even cancer, prices for drugs.
Next up will be Quinn on the topic of rising cost of drugs.
Yeah, so drugs right now are just way too expensive. And according to the Department of Health and Human Services, Americans are spending around $460 billion a year on drugs, which is just way too much money. In addition to that, they also stated that citizens in Europe and Canada only spend around 56% of what Americans do on the same drugs. So once again, we're just spending an absurd amount of money. And the best way to kind of discuss this is to dispel two large myths with what would happen if we were to just lower drug prices. So the first one is that if we were to lower drug prices, companies would not have enough money for research and development of future drugs, which is just simply not true. So Peter Bach of Memorial Sloan Kettering found that the 20 best-selling drugs actually cover the research and development costs for all drugs of the 15 companies that make them. So research and development costs for all drugs is generally for a big pharma company around $80 billion. And those top 20 drugs had a profit margin of $40 billion. Once again, that's profit, so they didn't even put that back into research and development costs. So clearly there's not a huge issue there. The second myth would be that drug prices must be high because that offsets the research and development costs of the failed drugs in these big pharma companies, which once again is just simply not true. So around 40% of drugs will fail in phase one. This is according to the Atlantic. And this is around $25 million per drug. Another 70% will fail in phase two, which is around $60 million per drug. And while that might seem like a lot of money, it's really not to these big pharma companies. So my solution would just to be have the government create a cap for the amount of money that each drug could be sold for. There's really no reason why they shouldn't do this. And I will pass it off to Ashton now to talk about counterfeit drugs.
Okay, it's on. As Quinn has discussed, the pharmaceutical industry has placed an unnecessary price on drugs. And this rise in price of drugs has caused a huge rise in counterfeit drugs being sold on the street. In the article written by Irwin Blackstone, The Health and Economic Effects of Counterfeit Drugs, has caused counterfeit drugs to start being increased in the US market. And because drugs come from all over the world and counterfeit drugs have started to come from all over the world, it would be super difficult to stop them from entering, according to the US House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce in 2014, because 40% of drugs come from overseas and 80% of active medicinal components are imported from overseas. The solution that I have come up with is to educate and increase public awareness. Many US consumers are unaware of the dangers and risks that come with using and purchasing counterfeit drugs. It is super important for us to establish this awareness because using these drugs has caused many deaths. In one case written about by Brian A. Lang in his paper Fade to Black, Importation Counterfeit Drugs, in one case involving cough syrup, harmful ingredients were used, such as floor wax, toxic yellow paint, powdered cement, and antifreeze. In this case, over 500 kids were killed all over the world. And this isn't the only case where counterfeit drugs have caused deaths. And this problem needs to stop. Establishing this awareness of counterfeit drugs could help consumers be wise and can help them and help the overall pharmaceutical industry regulate what is being sold. Now we will move into our discussion portion of the what could help the overall industry.
Awesome. So to start off our discussion period, I think it would be important, especially to elaborate kind of on our solutions, maybe starting with Nigel on repealing the Intermediate Act taxing, or Intermediate Act. Yes. Sorry.
For the Learned Intermediary Act, we want to hold companies accountable, and the only way to do that is to give the people the power to hold the companies accountable by suing the companies. Currently, they don't have the power to sue companies. And Quinn, I noticed that you want to make a cap for the prices of drugs, and that's also kind of holding the companies accountable. And I was thinking perhaps we could combine our two solutions into one and give the people the power to maybe decide if a drug costs too much, and if too many people come together and decide that they don't have access to the drug, but they need it, it's very necessary, then maybe they can have the power to sue them.
Yeah, I agree. I think your big point about getting the power back into the people's hands, I think that's really what we should focus on right now. I think Big Pharma is kind of taken over, and we as the United States, like citizens of the United States, don't really have that much control over it anymore. So I think that'd be a great idea if we repealed the Learned Intermediary Act, just kind of got that out of there. And then I also do agree that obviously I agree, yeah, if we could have a cap on the amount of money that drugs could be sold for, that would once again take the power out of Big Pharma's hands and back in our hands.
So kind of going on top of that, with my solution on being a small tax on the pharmaceutical industry, not necessarily putting the power into the people, but having that tax on the sale of drugs would take more power away from the big pharmacies, and would closely relate to having a cap, less profit for the distributors and the producers.
Yeah, I think the profit margins for these big pharma companies are a little outrageous, just the amount of money, because they're capitalizing off of citizens, and we really can't do anything about it because it's their drug or nothing, kind of like what Nigel was talking about.
Yeah, and that has caused a huge because it is such a high price, it has caused people to if they can't afford the drugs that they need, it has caused them to go to other solutions and go buy counterfeit drugs that can harm them, and they just are unaware of this. And so lowering the prices would definitely help with the counterfeit drug industry and put kind of a cap on it.
And we could maybe juxtapose these solutions and combine them. And Ashley, do you think that if we were able to actually get these solutions passed, then counterfeit drugs on the streets would reduce?
I think so, yeah. I think most of the counterfeit drug industry is pretty much caused by all the other issues that are in the pharmaceutical industry. And I feel if those were solved, then the counterfeit drug industry would definitely go down.
With having those big price on, I wouldn't call it name brand drugs, but forces the people to go, that is way too expensive, forces the people to go to counterfeit drugs. So yeah. I see that big issue right there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think given the following solutions, we've come to the idea that maybe the best idea is combining everything that everyone has said so far. Given the solution of repealing the Intermediate Act, taxing pharmaceutical market sales, adding a cap to drugs, and making sure that people are well educated, I think that we've given ourselves a solid path to go forward into the future. And it's simply a matter of following through with these regulations and properly keeping an eyeball on the future, that we have a bright future for the pharmaceutical industry and our generation going forward. As long as nobody else has anything to say, thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a wonderful holiday.